Thank you very much and good afternoon. The first thing I have to do is apologise to Bill, because when Bill asked me to speak on this platform, I first of all said no, which is a bad way to start a conversation, but then somebody reminded me that my flight was a bit later than I thought, and the airport is not very far away. So that's a great opportunity for me, and I do thank you for the opportunity to slot in at the start of your programme, because this is a very important issue. I was very happy this morning to speak about the next generation internet and our plans for that, and that's a theme that we've heard repeatedly today. I also said to somebody that I was very happy that this morning, for once, I didn't have to speak about free flow of data, but I'm going to speak about it now in the context that Bill has described, because that is an issue that we are working on very actively at the moment in the European Union, in the Commission. It's also an area where we have to realise that before we seek to tell others at a global level what they should do with their data and with their data localisation laws, in the European Union we have to get our own house in order. And that is because we do have a number of restrictions on data, and also we haven't had a full discussion as to why those restrictions exist and what it is exactly in the digital age that we are trying to achieve. Because we do have, as I said, a number of restrictions, but we also have underlying that quite a lot of legal uncertainty. It's not clear what is the situation at national level, but also what is the situation at European level. A lot of people are strongly aware now about our data protection laws, particularly the new General Data Protection Regulation, which sets a very high level. But that is actually the opportunity now for us, as I've said, to get our house in order, to establish what is it that we need to achieve with regard to data in terms of its security, but also in terms of its circulation. So we are now in a situation where we have been talking about data protection, particularly for personal data security for all types of data, but let's think of commercial secret data, which is not necessarily personal, versus the free flow of data, global trade, growing trade in services and services that depend on data, the internet, and all of the e-commerce and other social and economic developments that have taken place. As Europe gets its house in order on data protection, where we are now clear where we stand, we are clear actually what is one of the core European values that dictates not only our internal policy, but how we relate to the rest of the world. In this case, on trade, in relation to data, but also across a number of other issues. So now we can move to a situation in which we, ourselves, and then in consultation and discussion with our partners, are talking more about data flows versus protectionism. And protectionism in this sense is, for sometimes well-founded reasons but poorly executed, and sometimes for pure good old-fashioned protectionism, we have entities, governments, regions who are not keen on having a lot of data flowing. They're data flowing out when that might in fact be perceived as an economic advantage if the data has to stay locally. The data servers, the data service providers, and perhaps even the technologies will somehow also then gravitate to the same places where this data is being located. Now that's something which is more time than I can devote given the important discussion, but also something which we don't have to devote much time to, because the risk of the protection of personal data being used as an excuse for protectionism, as an excuse to create blockages, or as an excuse to keep data locally for reasons of industrial espionage or for surveillance by intelligence, for intelligence gathering purposes, etc. They all exist, and we know that they do so. And that's why, as I've said, the European Union has now got its house in order, because we can go to partners and say, we really want to do business with you, but this is how we treat the data of individuals, personal data. We know that many others share the same values. They may not articulate it in exactly the same way, but nevertheless, let's talk, let's discuss. Let's see if our system meets your needs. Let's see if your system is adequate to meet our needs for protecting that data. And in any event, we have large amounts and a growing amount of non-personal data, which is becoming the lifeblood of so many industrial sectors, and we really want to be plugged in, and we want you to be plugged in to the world economy as it grows and develops. So We are launched into a process of, under the Data Economy Initiative, proposing in the autumn a measure with regard to the free flow of data, which we already asked our member states the question, why do you restrict data? It's largely because it comes from the paper era. The tax authority needed your tax data. Your tax data was in a file in the filing cabinet in the basement, and that data needed to be handed over during a tax inspection. That data is now normally online. It is now electronic. In fact, more than half of the European Union member states' tax authorities refuse paper. You have to submit your data electronically. So we're in a different world. Surely legislation and regulation should move on. No, what the member states need for what are legitimate public policy purposes is to have access to that data for regulatory scrutiny under very clear public policy mandates. Well, let's work on that then. Let's make sure that you can fulfill that mandate rather than storing the data and freezing up taxation data, company law, company data, registration documentation, which is actually blocking and blocking the internal market in the European Union. Secondly, we have to require that certain data is subject to security. And there, again, it's digital. In one of the sessions which I had the privilege of listening to earlier on, it was said very clearly that we know from the experts, and I'm sure some of you, the experts, are in the room, storing data in your basement or on one server locally is not augmented security. It is actually the lowest level of security that you could possibly have. So again, let's identify security standards that certain critical sets of data need to be stored or processed under, but please, again, don't think that localization is the answer. And that's exactly the sort of things that we will be putting into place with the European Union member states in the autumn. That allows us to go then to our partners, who are also very keen on this issue. At the moment, for example, at CeBIT in March, the European Union announced with Japan that we are at the critical stage of negotiating a free trade agreement between Japan and the European Union. The Japanese authorities are very keen to have a chapter on data and data circulation. They want to be plugged into the European Union market. So what was announced in March was that we are now involved in what are formally called adequacy negotiations to see if the data protection regulation and the way it is implemented in Japan gives the equivalent protection that we would expect of that data here in the European Union. And by the way, it's already looking forward to May of next year when the GDPR will be in force so that it will be future-proofed. There are a number of like-minded countries who want to engage in the same discussion. But what about those who are not necessarily like-minded? There's a lot of discussion at a multilateral level about what could be future trade negotiations. And there we would expect the same for personal data. But then we find ourselves in some uncomfortable company on occasion, because some of the other countries will say, well, we too have a very high level of personal data protection. And it's cause for pause, because of what we think we know about some of those countries and jurisdictions would suggest that perhaps what we know already about protection of personal data is not actually the equivalent to what is in the European Union, but moreover that there may be other motives for having data of their citizens stored locally. So we have to be very careful at an international level. And now I will come to my concluding point, which is that while we internally within the European Union are discussing with members of the European Parliament, with the member states, as to how best in the future to ensure that digital trade supports our development agenda, that we are actually actively seeking to have free flow of data with our trading partners to ensure that everybody is benefiting from the developments of goods and services and technologies on the internet. We nevertheless have to ensure that we protect personal data, but more importantly, that we do not accept others for non-legitimate reasons to use data protection, for example, as an excuse to close the borders. And that is going to be a challenge in the future. And that is actually where, and I finish on this point, again, as I was saying this morning for other reasons, the multi-stakeholder model is important. Why? Because civil society, activists, and those who are engaged in non-governmental organizations are an essential source of information and intelligence in the course of any discussion to understand just how is data treated elsewhere, just what would be the implications of a free flow of data agreement with another particular country, but also what does happen to data which a partner may say they must store locally. So we wish to continue to discuss in the institutions that exist, and I'm thinking particularly of the IGF, in the future, these issues of data flows, in order to ensure that what we do at European level is actually based on fact, it is realistic, and that it does not have unwanted and unforeseen negative consequences at a global level. But I leave you with the thought that once we can be sure that we are protecting personal data, it is for the good of all, it is for economic and social development worldwide, which we all have an obligation to support, that we have the free flow of data at an international level and that we remove data localization requirements. I hope I haven't been too long. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you.